It's not often that I get a chance to work on a quality machine like this Stihl pole saw, which they technically call a pole pruner. But no matter what you call it, most would describe it as a high quality machine. But if so, does that mean you should be able to leave fuel in it for a long time and it'd be okay? Well, that's what they did with this one. However, as you might have guessed from the title, it now has problems, but is it the fault of the machine or the owner? In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Stihl pole saw, and the problem is that according to the owner, it's kind of tough to start, but once it does start, it won't stay running. Now, I'm going to try and repair this pole saw, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you like it is in this video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. The first thing I want to do is to take a look around and see if there's anything obviously wrong with it. I'm looking for anything broken or missing that might be part of the problem, but luckily I don't see anything like that. After that, we'll then want to try and start it and see the problem for ourselves. Now, luckily there is fuel in the tank, but we can't tell anything about it while it's in there. But I am going to leave it in there until we try to start it, then we'll pour it out and examine it. So the moment I squeeze the trigger, it takes the carb off a high idle and it stops. Now, normally I would try and make adjustments to the fuel adjustment screws, but this time I want to do a full inspection and cleaning, and the reason why is because I believe the carb has been damaged from leaving fuel in the system. And when that happens, no amount of adjusting is going to make it any better. But I guess it really depends on what you mean by better. Yes, in a pinch, adjusting the carb might make it usable, but depending upon how bad the carb is, the engine might have to run at a high speed to keep from dying, which is not what you want when dealing with a pole saw, but it might be okay if this was a string trimmer or leaf blower though. The reason why is because if the engine has to be kept at a higher than normal speed to keep it from dying, it also means the chain will be moving as well. And if you've never had to use one of these before, with the chain far away from you, you might be safe, but other items and more importantly, other people might be at risk to get hurt. So it's been sitting in the sun for a couple of hours since I got done giving it a quick spray and rinse, and I feel a whole lot better working on it now. So next, we're going to pour out the fuel that was in the tank, only to find out that there's no water in it and that it looks perfectly fine. And after talking with the owner, it turns out they had already poured out the old fuel and put fresh fuel in it. Now, while the fuel may not be the problem, we can at least check that the fuel filter is still connected to the line in the tank, which it is. Now, if the fuel filter had come off the line, it would mean that unfiltered fuel was making it into the carb and could have clogged the inlet screen, which would cause our problem. Next, we'll need to take the carb off for an inspection and see if it needs to be cleaned and how all the diaphragms are doing. So I did end up breaking the shorter of the fuel lines, which I do believe is the filter line from the tank. We will confirm that later on and also repair it once we've looked at the carb. Now, you do not need to take off the engine cover like I'm doing to work on the carb, but I'm also going to be doing more maintenance to this engine because I do not have any history on it. So this is the way I checked to see if that line was the filter line. Now, while I was pressing on the bulb, fuel should be leaving the carb, but since the line that I broke is not leaking fuel, that means the fuel is leaving through the unbroken line, meaning the broken line is the filter line. I know it sounds a bit confusing, but once you try it yourself, it'll make more sense. However, this method won't work if there's no fuel in the carb, but there is another way. Simply put your finger over one of the ports and then press on the bulb. If the bulb becomes difficult to push, it means the port you have your finger on is the return, making the other port for the filter. Next, we'll take off the purge bulb section to expose the metering diaphragm, which helps to control fuel flow through the carb. Now, it's supposed to be soft and pliable, but as you can tell, it's not that way at all, which is why this carb is not working like it should be. After taking it off the carb for a better look, you can tell that it's not as soft as it should be. Now, it's not petrified because if it was, I wouldn't be able to bend it. Instead, it should be more like a piece of cotton and not this. Since it's not completely petrified, I'm going to try and save it for a different project by dropping it into a rejuvenation bath for a couple of days. The longer it sits in here, the better, but I do plan on checking it later on to see how it's going. Next, we'll be inspecting the pumping side of the carb. If this part is not working like it should be, it will not be able to pull fuel from the tank. Now, the carb is a bit dirty, and I want to try to safely clean it with some carb cleaner, so I'll be taking the needle and rocker arm assembly out of it. Just be careful when you take these tiny parts out of the carb because they're very easy to lose. The first place I want to clean is the inlet screen, and also I want to try and make sure that the cleaner will pass through it. Now if it doesn't, just leave the pocket filled with cleaner until it eventually passes through. Once most of the carb has been taken apart, I'll then spray it down with some carb cleaner. I'll then go back and then carefully take the pumping diaphragm section apart, that way I can clean it too. Now the diaphragm with the check valves looks to be in great shape, it's just a little dirty though. But the larger spring-loaded section I'm not so sure about, since this is not a common design for most other carbs. The best I can do is to check and make sure that there are no tears in it and then clean it off the best I can. I'll then spray down the rest of the parts with carb cleaner, and even though I'm pretty sure I could put it back together, I'm going to instead put the parts into the basket for the ultrasonic cleaner for a couple of cycles. Now I do have some very strong opinions about the use of my ultrasonic cleaner, but for the most part I do like it because it does get the parts looking fairly clean. So after the parts have come out of the ultrasonic cleaner, they of course should be ready to be put back together. So I ended up running two 20-minute cycles in the cleaner and then one cycle with just clean water. And after the parts came out, I then used some compressed air to blow out any remaining water in the passages of the carb. Then comes the task of carefully installing all those tiny parts back into the carb. Just take your time and try not to lose one of these parts, because if you lose one of them, you're going to have to use a magnet to try and find it. I do have a recommendation for you. If you don't want to deal with all this work, then just replace the carb. And if you care about getting a quality carb instead of a cheap one, then choose the expensive version. Just don't be surprised when you find out that an OEM carb could be 3 to 4 times more than the price of a cheap one. So here's the old metering diaphragm, and it's been soaking for about 24 hours, and I can already tell that it's a lot more flexible than it was before. It's still not ready to be used quite yet, but if I had to, I guess I could reuse it now. But I'd be more comfortable if I'd soaked it in there for about another day or two. But in the meantime, I'll be using one of my new diaphragms that I keep in stock. So next we're going to put the carb back together, and I hate to admit it, but I did get lost when trying to put this large diaphragm back in. But that's when looking at pictures, or in this case the video that I took, helped me to put it back together. Just for your information, it took me about an hour to take this carb apart, clean it, and put it back together. Now that does include the time that it was in the ultrasonic cleaner, but a brand new cheap carb is only $11 plus tax. So let that sink in for a moment. Would you rather invest more time into it or just pay $11 to get a working part? So as you just saw, I did remove that bit of broken fuel line and replaced it with some yellow fuel line instead. Now the advantage of having the yellow fuel line is that it allows us to see if fuel is being pulled up by the carb. Once the fuel lines have been connected to the carb, we'll then connect the throttle linkage to it and then check to see if it works, and then install the air filter base. Just don't forget to connect the emissions breather hose to the brass port on the base, otherwise it might affect how the engine runs. Now you would think that we were pretty much done with this project, but we still have 2 more items we need to check. So if you didn't know, these little 4-mix engines have valves just like a 4-cycle engine, even though they use 2-stroke fuel. And if a small engine has valves, there's a good chance that you'll need to check the valve clearances. I'm also going to check the gap on the spark plug, and for that I'll be using a 25 thousandths of an inch feeler, but you're welcome to use whatever value you think it should be. Now when I was trying to put the feeler into the gap, it was a bit tight to begin with, but eventually I was able to get it to fit. Next, we'll take off the valve cover to expose the rocker arms, and then check to see if we need to adjust them. So I'm supposed to put the engine on top dead center on the compression stroke, but I find it much easier if I turn the engine until one of the rocker arms is all the way down while the other one is loose. I'll then use this piece of a 4 thousandths of an inch feeler to slide in the clearance on the loose arm. And what we discover is that the feeler is loose, meaning the clearance here is a lot bigger than the 4 thousandths of an inch feeler and will need to be adjusted back down. But in the meantime, I'm going to rotate the engine to check on the clearance for the other arm. Now this time, however, the feeler didn't fit, meaning the clearance here is a lot smaller than 4 thousandths and will need to be adjusted to make it larger. To make the clearance larger, we'll need to turn the adjusting nut counterclockwise, and we'll turn it enough times until the feeler just barely fits. We'll then turn the engine back so we can adjust the other rocker arm as well. However, this time, we'll need to make the clearance smaller, and to do that, we'll need to turn the adjusting nut clockwise and make enough turns until the feeler just barely fits in the clearance. So once all the adjustments have been made, we can then replace the valve cover and its fastener, and then move on to the very last item we need to check. So the very last item we need to check is a bit controversial, because some consumers have a very strong opinion about it, but either way, we're going to have to inspect it. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's the spark arrestor screen, and its job is its namesake. It sits in the muffler's exhaust outlet and it helps to keep sparks from leaving the muffler and possibly starting a fire. But as a byproduct, it will also collect a lot of carbon over time and could eventually clog up the screen and prevent the engine from working correctly. Now luckily this one was clear and did not need any sort of cleaning, so we'll put it back in. But if your spark arrestor screen is beginning to build up with carbon, then use a torch or brake cleaner and a wire brush to clean it. So finally, after all that work, we can put the cover back onto the engine along with the bolts and put some fuel into the tank and then see if the purge bulb works. I will let you know that if you bought a new carb for your engine, it may not work without some adjustments to it. Now that may not be the case if you bought an OEM carb, but it definitely applies if you bought a cheap one. But after a couple of presses on the bulb, you can see fuel filling the yellow fuel line and eventually the bulb as well. Now, if your primer bulb is not filling up with any fuel, then you'll need to go back through the carb again or maybe replace your fuel filter. Well, as you just saw, it started without any issues and it works great. Now, just because it started and ran perfectly doesn't mean it's ready to leave here just yet. Instead, I've got to let it cool down as much as possible and do another cold start. In fact, the more times I can do that, the better it'll be, and in my case, I like to see 3 successful consecutive cold starts and test runs before I'm okay with it. Now, this particular project was a best case scenario, meaning we got away with a new diaphragm, purge bulb, and a small section of fuel line to get it to work again. All in all, it was only about $1.50 for parts. Now, the worst case scenario would have been to replace the carb, which has about a 90% success rate from my experience. Now, don't worry, I'll let the owner know what the problem was, and then we'll see if they leave fuel in it again or if they try a different method. So my question is, do you leave fuel in your equipment during long-term storage, and if so, have you ever had any problems when trying to use them afterwards? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.